The great hall of the Galactic Council buzzed with quiet conversation. Representatives from hundreds of worlds sat in their special seats, each designed for their unique body shapes. Some had tentacles, others had wings, and a few glowed softly in the dim light. Today was supposed to be simple, just another boring meeting about mining rights and trade disputes. Thex Andor, the tall blue being who ran the Military Affairs Committee, stepped forward to the speaking platform. His forearms moved nervously as he looked at the datapad in his hands. The room grew quiet. "Honored representatives," Thex Andor began, his voice shaking slightly. "I have urgent news that will change everything we thought we knew about the approaching crisis, the Void Swarm." Everyone in the hall knew what that meant. For 3,000 years, these dark creatures had swept across the galaxy, eating entire star systems. Every civilized race had learned the same hard lesson. When the swarm came, you ran. You hid. You hoped they would pass by and leave you alone. The humans, Thex Andor continued, have made a decision that defies all logic and wisdom. A soft gasp went through the crowd. The humans were new to the galaxy. Their planet Earth had only been contacted 6 months ago. They were primitive, by galactic standards, barely capable of faster-than-light travel. Most council members saw them as just another young species that would need centuries to become truly civilized. "The humans have declared their intention to march to battle against the Void Swarm." The hall erupted. Representatives jumped to their feet, tentacles waving wildly, wings flapping in distress. The crystalline collective representatives chimed like broken bells. The gas-based nebula folk swirled in agitated clouds. "Impossible!" shrieked Velkara from the peaceful hegemony. "No species voluntarily faces the swarm. It's suicide." Thex Andor raised all 4 arms for silence. "I have their official statement here, and their ambassador is waiting outside to address the council." The great doors at the back of the hall opened with a soft hiss. A human woman walked in, her footsteps echoing in the sudden silence. She wore a simple blue uniform with strange markings on her shoulders. Her hair was pulled back severely, and her dark eyes showed no fear as she looked around the massive hall. Commander Sarah Chen had been chosen as humanity's representative to the galaxy. She was not the tallest human nor the strongest, but something in her bearing made even the largest alien representatives feel small. She walked to the speaking platform without hurrying. The council members stared at her with dozens of different types of eyes. Some had never seen a human up close before. "Honored Council," Sarah began, her voice clear and strong. "I am Commander Sarah Chen, speaking for the people of Earth and our colonies. We have studied the data you provided about the Void Swarm. We have analyzed their attack patterns, their feeding habits, and their projected course through this sector." She paused, looking around the hall. "We have reached a conclusion that appears to differ from yours." The silence was complete now. Even the usually chattering hive minds had gone quiet. "You see the swarm as an unstoppable force of nature. You treat them like a cosmic storm, something to hide from until it passes. We see them differently." Sarah touched a device on her wrist. A 3-dimensional map appeared in the air above the platform. It showed the galaxy, with dark red areas marking where the swarm had been active. "Look at the pattern," she said. "The swarm always attacks the same way. They probe defenses, then overwhelm them with numbers. They expect their enemies to run or hide. But what happens when someone doesn't run? What happens when someone attacks them instead?" Representative Glixoth of the Ancient Watchers spoke up, his voice like grinding stone. "Young human, we have faced the swarm for millennia. Many species have tried to fight them. All have failed." "Have they?" Sarah asked. "Or have they all tried the same failed strategies? Defensive positions, energy shields, retreat when overwhelmed. The swarm has learned to counter these tactics over thousands of years." She manipulated the map, highlighting several star systems. "But look here, and here. Small groups of swarm entities that were completely destroyed. Not driven off, destroyed. What do these incidents have in common?" The council members leaned forward, studying the display. Even they had to admit the pattern was intriguing. "In each case," Sarah continued, "the swarm encountered unexpected resistance, pirates who had nothing to lose, automated defense systems using obsolete weapons, small groups who fought with desperation instead of strategy. The swarm struggled against unpredictable tactics. She turned off the display and faced the council directly. Humanity brings something new to this fight. We don't think like you do. We don't have your wisdom or your advanced technology. But we have something else. We have the ability to choose our own destruction rather than wait for it to choose us. The hall buzzed with confused whispers. The concept seemed alien to most of the representatives. Velkara stood up, her flowing robes rippling with emotion. Commander Chen, we understand your species' bravery, but bravery alone cannot defeat the swarm. We offer you sanctuary in the core worlds. Your people can survive this crisis safely. Sarah smiled, but it was not a happy expression. Representative Velkara, we appreciate your offer, truly. But we're not interested in survival if it means letting the darkness win. But why? Asked Elder Mordun of the Timeless Circle. Why throw away your lives for a cause that cannot succeed? Sarah was quiet for a moment, thinking about how to explain something that felt obvious to her but seemed impossible to them. Because someone needs to hit back, she said finally. For 3,000 years, the galaxy has been losing ground to the swarm. Star system after star system, gone forever. How many more will be lost if everyone keeps running? She walked closer to the council seats, looking directly at the representatives. We've run the numbers. At the current rate of expansion, the swarm will consume the entire galaxy within 10,000 years, maybe sooner. Every species here will eventually face extinction anyway, so we choose to face it now, on our terms, while we still can make a difference. The silence that followed was different from before. It was the silence of minds trying to process something completely new. Thexandor finally spoke. Commander, even if your analysis is correct, humanity lacks the military strength to challenge the swarm. Your entire fleet could not defeat even a small swarm cluster. Alone? No, Sarah agreed. But we're not asking anyone to join us. We're simply informing the council of our decision, as required by galactic law. Humanity will march to battle. We will face the swarm with everything we have. She turned to leave, then paused. We do have one request. When we fail, because we probably will, remember that we tried. Remember that someone chose to fight instead of run. Maybe that will inspire someone else to try something different. As Commander Chen walked out of the hall, the council members sat in stunned silence. In all their long histories, none of them had ever heard anything like what they had just witnessed. Humans were marching to war against an unbeatable enemy, not because they thought they could win, but because they believed someone had to try. For the first time in 3,000 years, the Galactic Council had to consider a new possibility. Maybe the swarm could be fought after all. News of humanity's declaration spread across the galaxy faster than light itself. Within days, every civilized world knew about the strange species from the Sol system that planned to attack the Void Swarm. Most reactions were the same: confusion, disbelief, and something that might have been pity. On the crystal spires of Velkoth Prime, the Ethereal Council gathered in emergency session. Their flowing, translucent forms pulsed with concern as they discussed the humans' announcement. They cannot possibly understand what they face, whispered Elder Christhera, her voice like wind chimes in a gentle breeze. The swarm has consumed entire star clusters. What can one small species hope to accomplish? Similar conversations happened on 1,000 worlds. The gas giant dwellers of the Helix Nebula paused their eternal dances to discuss the humans. The machine intelligences of the core worlds calculated and recalculated the probability of human success. The numbers always came back the same: 0.0%. But something unexpected was happening in the outer systems, far from the civilized core worlds. Long-range sensors began picking up massive increases in activity around human colonies. Admiral Quexelin of the Galactic Monitoring Service stared at the data streaming across his screens. His scaled fingers drummed nervously on his command chair as he called up system after system. "This cannot be correct," he muttered to his aide, a young officer named Plix. "Run the scans again." Plix's tentacles danced over the control panels. "Sir, I've run them 4 times. The readings are accurate." What they were seeing defied belief. Every human colony, from the industrial world of New Detroit to the agricultural settlements on the rim worlds, was transforming itself at an impossible speed. On New Detroit, massive factories that had been producing consumer goods for export were being retooled overnight. The planet's 3 billion inhabitants had voted unanimously to convert their entire industrial base to military production. Assembly lines that once made household appliances now churned out weapons, armor, and ship components. The mining colonies were even more dramatic. On Kepler Station, miners who had spent their lives digging for rare metals suddenly found themselves extracting materials at 10 times their normal rate. They worked around the clock, sleeping in shifts, driven by something the alien observers couldn't understand. "They're not being forced," Plix reported, confusion clear in his voice. "Our intelligence intercepts show that human civilians are volunteering for this. They're leaving comfortable lives to work in dangerous conditions." Admiral Quexelin studied the reports flowing in from across human space. Agricultural worlds were converting farmland to training grounds. Research stations were abandoning long-term projects to focus on weapons development. Most shocking of all, humans were volunteering for military service in numbers that made no logical sense. On Earth itself, the transformation was most visible. Spaceports that had handled commercial traffic now buzzed with military vessels. The planet's orbital shipyards, once modest facilities for building cargo haulers, expanded daily as new construction platforms came online. Commander Chen stood in the war room beneath Geneva, looking at displays that showed humanity's mobilization in real time. Around her, officers and civilians worked together with an intensity that impressed even her. "Ma'am," called Lieutenant Torres from the communications station, "we're getting reports from every colony world. Recruitment centers are overwhelmed. We have more volunteers than we can train." Sarah nodded, but her expression remained serious. "What about the production numbers?" "Exceeding all projections," reported Colonel Martinez from the logistics desk. "The Martian shipyards will complete the first new Dreadnought-class vessels 3 weeks ahead of schedule. The asteroid belt mining operations are producing raw materials faster than we can process them." It wasn't just the scale of the mobilization that amazed galactic observers. It was the attitude behind it. Intercepted human communications showed families saying goodbye to each other not with despair, but with pride. Parents were proud to send their children to join the fleet. Children were proud of parents who left comfortable jobs to build weapons. The alien intelligence services tried to understand this phenomenon. They had files on thousands of species, but nothing in their experience explained human behavior. "Perhaps it's a form of mass psychosis," suggested Dr. Velthera, the galaxy's leading expert on primitive species psychology. "They may not truly comprehend what they're facing." But deeper investigation revealed something more complex. Humans understood exactly what they were facing. Their military analysts had studied every available piece of data about the Void Swarm. They knew the odds. They knew they would probably die. They were doing it anyway. On the peaceful hegemony's capital world, Representative Velcara called an emergency meeting with her advisors. The elegant being was known throughout the galaxy for her wisdom and compassion. She had spent centuries helping younger species find their place in galactic civilization. "We must try again," she told her staff. "Surely we can make them understand. They're throwing away their entire civilization for nothing." She authorized another diplomatic mission to Earth. The ship that arrived carried the most valuable gift the hegemony could offer: guaranteed sanctuary for the entire human species in the protected core worlds. It was an offer that had saved dozens of civilizations from various cosmic disasters. Commander Chen met the delegation in person, showing them the respect their reputation deserved. But her answer remained the same. "Representative Velcara, your offer is incredibly generous. If we fail, we hope you'll remember some of our people. But we're not changing course." "But why?" Velcara asked, genuine anguish in her musical voice. "Your species has so much potential. Given time, you could become a great civilization. Why waste that for a hopeless gesture?" Sarah looked out the window of the conference room at the busy spaceport beyond. Ships were launching constantly now, carrying supplies and personnel to assembly points throughout human space. "Because," she said quietly, "what's the point of becoming a great civilization if we do it by hiding while others suffer? The swarm isn't just threatening us, it's threatening everyone." "But other species accept this risk," Velcara protested. We've learned to live with the swarm. Evacuation protocols, defensive systems, strategic retreats, these methods work. They work for survival, Sarah agreed. But they don't work for victory. And maybe it's time someone tried for victory. As the diplomatic mission returned to hegemony space with news of their failure, something else was happening that few observers noticed at first. The humans weren't just preparing to fight the swarm. They were preparing to fight it in ways no one had ever tried before. In hidden research facilities, human scientists worked on projects that made galactic experts shake their heads in amazement. Instead of focusing on energy weapons and force fields like every other species, humans were developing kinetic weapons, chemical explosives, and electromagnetic pulse devices. Their technology is primitive, reported the Galactic Technology Assessment Board, but it's also completely unpredictable. The swarm has never encountered weapons like these. More disturbing to the galaxy's military experts was how humans were training for combat. Other species trained their soldiers to follow orders, maintain formations, and use standard tactics. Human training emphasized improvisation, individual initiative, and something called thinking outside the box. They're training their people to be unpredictable, Admiral Quexelin reported to the Council. Every human soldier is taught to make independent decisions in combat. From a tactical standpoint, it should create chaos in their ranks. Should, noted Council member Thexendor. But somehow, they make it work. As weeks passed, the galaxy watched in fascination as humanity's preparation reached a fever pitch. The most shocking development came when 3 species that had been considered extinct suddenly emerged from deep space hiding to offer their support to the human cause. The last survivors of the Forge Masters, an ancient species of master engineers, arrived at human space stations with offers to help improve weapon designs. The Ghost Fleet Collective, cybernetic beings who had fled beyond the galactic rim, returned with knowledge of swarm weaknesses. Most surprising of all, the Eternal Watch, mystical beings who had withdrawn from physical reality itself, sent cryptic messages of support. The humans, read one translated message, remember what we forgot, that some things are worth dying for. The galactic media couldn't get enough of the story. Every day brought new reports of human preparations, human volunteers, human innovations. The species that had been considered primitive just months ago was now the most talked-about civilization in the galaxy. But underneath the fascination was a growing sense of unease. The humans weren't just preparing for a suicide mission, they were preparing as if they expected to win. Their confidence was either inspiring or terrifying, depending on who was watching. Commander Chen's final message to the Galactic Council before the human fleet departed was simple and direct. We're not marching to our deaths. We're marching to victory. The only question is whether anyone will have the courage to march with us. The day humanity's fleet departed Earth marked the beginning of the most watched military movement in galactic history. Every major civilization had sensors trained on human space, recording everything for historical archives that most expected would serve as a monument to brave foolishness. Admiral Sarah Chen, newly promoted to lead the entire human war effort, stood on the bridge of the UES Defiance, humanity's first purpose-built dreadnought. Around her, thousands of ships stretched across space in formations that impressed even the galaxy's military experts. All fleet elements report ready, Admiral, announced Captain Martinez from the communications station. 3,700 combat vessels, 8,000 support ships, and more volunteers than we have room for. Sarah nodded, studying the tactical display that showed their route to the projected swarm incursion point. It would take them through systems that had been abandoned by other species decades ago, past the ruins of worlds that had fallen to previous. Swarm attacks! Signal the fleet, she ordered. All ships, begin jump sequence. Today we start the longest march in human history. What followed amazed galactic observers even more than humanity's decision to fight. The human fleet didn't just travel toward the swarm, they transformed every system they passed through into a fortress. In the Kelper 442 system, abandoned 40 years earlier when the hegemony retreated before a swarm probe, human engineering, teams arrived and began rebuilding. Within days, the dead system buzzed with activity as automated defense platforms came online and supply depots took shape on barren asteroids. This is impossible, muttered Admiral Quexelin as he watched the sensor readings. No species has ever attempted to hold territory this far from their core worlds. The logistics alone should be overwhelming. But the humans had planned for this. Instead of the centralized supply chains used by other civilizations, humanity created what they called distributed logistics. Every ship in their fleet carried manufacturing equipment. Every asteroid they claimed became a mini-factory. Every abandoned space station became a repair facility. The Ghost Fleet Collective, the cybernetic beings who had emerged from exile to help humanity, proved invaluable in this effort. Their knowledge of automated systems and resource management helped human engineers achieve the impossible. They were building an empire as they marched to war. Report from the Vanguard Fleet, called Lieutenant Park from the sensor station. They've established forward bases in the Rigel sector. All previously abandoned systems are now operational. Sarah studied the strategic map. In just 3 weeks, humanity had done something no other species had even attempted. They had created a supply line stretching across a quarter of the galaxy, defended by systems that could support themselves indefinitely. But the real shock came when the first alien volunteers arrived. It started small. A cargo ship from the Independent Mining Guild appeared at one of the human forward bases, requesting permission to join the supply effort. Then a squadron of fighters from the Free Trader Alliance asked to be assigned escort duty. Within days, the trickle became a flood. "Admiral," reported Commander Torres, barely able to keep the amazement out of her voice, "we have 17 different species requesting permission to join our fleet. The Forge Masters are sending their entire remaining battle group. The Crystal Collective wants to assign a full war council to coordinate with our operations." Sarah looked around the bridge at her crew. These people had volunteered to lead what everyone expected to be a doomed mission. Now they found themselves commanding the largest military alliance in recorded galactic history. How many total ships are we looking at? As of this morning, over 15,000 combat vessels and 30,000 support ships. The numbers are growing every hour. The transformation was visible from across the galaxy. Systems that had been dark for decades suddenly blazed with light as human-led alliance forces moved in and began reconstruction. The abandoned border, zones that had separated civilized space from swarm territory, were becoming the most heavily defended region in the galaxy. On the crystal spires of Velkoth Prime, Elder Christhara watched the reports with growing wonder. "They are not simply marching to battle," she whispered to her fellow council members. "They are transforming the battlefield itself." The humans had done more than inspire other species to join them. They had completely changed how war was fought. Instead of the traditional approach of massing fleets for single decisive battles, humanity was building what their strategists called aggressive infrastructure. Every system they occupied became a fortress. Every asteroid became a weapons platform. Every abandoned space station became a command center. They weren't just preparing to fight the swarm, they were preparing to fight it everywhere at once. The Forge Masters, ancient engineers whose species had been reduced to just a few thousand survivors, found themselves working alongside human technicians to create defensive systems that had never been imagined before. The humans had a saying that fascinated them: "If you can't go around a problem, go through it." Their approach to engineering defies all conventional wisdom, reported Master Smith Krexthul to his people. They build systems that should fail, then find ways to make them work anyway. It's magnificent madness. The Ghost Fleet Collective, beings who had spent centuries perfecting the art of hiding from the swarm, discovered that working with humans had given them something they had lost: hope. "For 400 years we have run," transmitted Fleet Command Node Zephyr 7. "The humans have reminded us what it means to stand and fight. But it was the arrival of the Eternal Watch that truly stunned the galaxy. These mystical beings, who existed partially outside normal space-time, had not been seen by anyone for over 1,000 years. They appeared suddenly at the human command base, bringing with them knowledge that changed everything. The swarm is not invincible," spoke their representative, a shifting pattern of light and energy that hurt to look at directly. "It is simply very, very old. It has grown used to victory. You offer something it has not encountered in millennia: genuine unpredictability." Admiral Chen met with the Eternal Watch representative in a specially prepared chamber aboard the Defiance. The conversation that followed was recorded and would later be studied by philosophers and military strategists for centuries. "You see patterns in the swarm's behavior that we missed?" Sarah asked. "We see the patterns of fear, the being replied. The swarm consumes because it is afraid of being consumed. It attacks because it fears being attacked. It has become a creature of pure reaction, no longer capable of true thought. And that's a weakness? Everything that acts purely from fear has the same weakness. It can be surprised. The knowledge shared by the Eternal Watch revolutionized human battle plans. The swarm wasn't just a mindless force of destruction, it was a traumatized entity that had forgotten how to think strategically. It could be outmaneuvered, confused, even frightened. As the human-led alliance approached the edge of swarm space, their confidence was no longer seen as naive optimism. They had built something unprecedented. A military force that combined the wisdom of the galaxy's oldest species with the innovation of its youngest. "Final approach to the swarm detection grid," announced Captain Martinez. "All Alliance fleets report ready for combat." Sarah looked at the tactical display one last time. In 4 weeks, humanity had gone from being an unknown species planning a suicide mission to leading the largest military alliance in galactic history. They controlled more territory than some ancient empires, commanded more ships than had ever been assembled in one place, and most importantly, they had given the galaxy something it had lost long ago: hope. "Signal all ships," she ordered. "We are about to show the swarm something it hasn't seen in 3,000 years. We're about to show it what happens when the galaxy decides to fight back." The Alliance fleet, now over 50,000 strong, began its final approach to swarm space. Behind them stretched a chain of fortified systems that could support the war effort indefinitely. Ahead of them waited an enemy that had terrorized the galaxy for millennia. For the first time in anyone's memory, the odds didn't seem impossible anymore. The first contact between the human-led alliance and the Void Swarm happened exactly as predicted by galactic strategists, and nothing like anyone expected. Admiral Sarah Chen stood on the bridge of the UES Defiance as sensor readings showed the approaching swarm entities. The tactical display revealed thousands of dark shapes moving through space like a living shadow, each one the size of a small moon. For 3,000 years, this sight had meant the end of civilizations. "Swarm. Forward elements detected," reported Captain Martinez, his voice steady despite the magnitude of what they faced. "Estimated contact in 4 hours. Signal the fleet," Sarah ordered. "Execute battle plan Hammer, all ships to assigned positions." What happened next would be discussed in military academies for generations. Instead of forming the defensive formations that every other species had used against the swarm, the human fleet scattered into thousands of small groups, each following seemingly random flight paths. "Admiral," called Lieutenant Park from the sensor station, "the Alliance members are requesting clarification. The Crystal Collective says our formation appears to be chaos." Sarah smiled grimly. "Tell them that's exactly the point, the swarm." Entities approached the battle zone expecting the familiar pattern, dense defensive formations that they could overwhelm with superior numbers. Instead, they found something that confused their collective intelligence, an enemy that seemed to have no formation at all. When the first swarm cluster reached the human lines, it encountered a single squadron of fighters that immediately split apart and began attacking from 6 different directions simultaneously. The swarm entities, programmed by millions of years of evolution to expect predictable responses, hesitated for the first time in recorded history. "Swarm advance has slowed," reported Commander Torres from the tactical station. "They're not pursuing our ships according to their normal pattern." "That's because they don't understand what we're doing," Sarah replied. "They've fought civilized armies for so long, they've forgotten how to fight a war." The human strategy defied every principle of space combat that had been developed over the millennia. Instead of seeking decisive battles with clear winners and losers, human forces engaged in what they called persistent harassment. Small groups would attack swarm entities, retreat before they could be overwhelmed, then attack again from a different direction. But it wasn't just the tactics that confused the swarm, it was the weapons. Human kinetic projectiles punched through swarm armor that had been designed to deflect energy weapons. Human electromagnetic pulse devices scrambled the bioelectric fields that allowed swarm entities to communicate. Most disturbing of all, human chemical explosives created toxic clouds that actually caused swarm entities to retreat. "Impossible," whispered Elder Morden as he watched the battle reports from the council chambers. "The swarm has never retreated. from a local engagement. But retreat they did. For the first time in anyone's memory, swarm entities were pulling back from human positions, regrouping, trying to understand what they faced. The real breakthrough came when Commander Lisa Zhang, leading a squadron of experimental assault ships, tried something that violated every rule of space combat. When her squadron was surrounded by swarm entities, instead of fighting their way out or calling for rescue, she ordered a direct ramming attack. "All ships, emergency burn straight at the cluster center," she commanded. "If we're going down, we're taking them with us." What happened next shocked everyone monitoring the battle. As human ships crashed into swarm entities, the creatures didn't just take damage, they panicked. The precise formations that had been maintained for thousands of years suddenly collapsed as individual swarm entities tried to flee the kamikaze attacks. "The ramming attacks are causing systemic disruption in their formation integrity," reported Dr. Velthera, who was monitoring the battle from a safe distance. "The swarm appears to be afraid." Admiral Chen studied the tactical displays as reports flooded in from across the battle zone. Human forces were taking heavy losses, but something unprecedented was happening. They were winning. "Ma'am," called Captain Martinez, "we're getting reports from all sectors. Swarm entities are retreating from human-controlled space. Some clusters have broken formation entirely." Sarah nodded, but her expression remained focused. "Phase 1 is working. Signal. All ships, execute Phase 2. Phase 2 of the human battle plan was even more radical than the first. Instead of pursuing the retreating swarm entities, human forces began doing something no military strategist had ever attempted. They started fortifying conquered swarm territory. The Alliance fleet poured into systems that had been controlled by the swarm for centuries, setting up defensive positions and supply depots in areas that other species considered permanently lost. The Forge Masters, working alongside human engineers, began constructing permanent bases on worlds that had been stripped bare by swarm feeding. "This is madness," protested Admiral Quexlin as he watched the human forces dig in. "They're trying to hold territory inside swarm space itself. The moment the creatures regroup, those bases will be overwhelmed." But the swarm didn't regroup the way everyone expected. The collective intelligence that had coordinated their attacks for millennia seemed to be struggling with something it had never encountered before. An enemy that didn't follow the rules. Human psychological warfare specialists, working with data provided by the Eternal Watch, had identified a crucial weakness in the swarm's mental structure. The creatures were not just physically connected, but psychologically dependent on their certainty of victory. Human tactics were creating something the swarm hadn't experienced in so long they had forgotten how to handle it: doubt. "Swarm communication patterns are becoming increasingly erratic," reported the analysis team. "They appear to be experiencing something analogous to confusion or even fear." The breakthrough came on the 4th day of battle, when the human ship UES Persistence, commanded by Captain James Rodriguez, found itself alone and surrounded by an entire swarm cluster. Following standard human doctrine, Rodriguez prepared for a ramming attack that would take as many enemies with him as possible. But something extraordinary happened. As the Persistence accelerated toward the center of the swarm formation, the creatures didn't just retreat, they fled. An entire cluster of swarm entities, each one capable of destroying a small fleet, scattered before a single human ship. The psychological effect rippled through the entire swarm. For the first time in 3,000 years, individual swarm entities began abandoning their positions without orders from the collective. The iron discipline that had made them unstoppable was breaking down. "Report from all sectors," announced Commander Torres, barely able to believe what she was reading. "Swarm forces are in full retreat. They're abandoning systems they've held for centuries." Sarah studied the strategic display, watching as red markers representing swarm territory turned blue as human alliance forces claimed system after system. In 4 days, they had accomplished what the galaxy had considered impossible. They had made the swarm afraid. "Signal the fleet," she ordered. "All ships pursue and engage. Don't give them time to regroup." The chase that followed became known as the Great Pursuit. Human-led forces, now reinforced by Alliance members who could barely believe what they were witnessing, followed the retreating swarm across dozens of star systems. Each engagement was easier than the last as the swarm's confidence continued to erode. The crystalline collective, species that communicated through harmonic resonance, began singing something that had never been heard before. Songs of victory over the swarm. The Ghost Fleet Collective emerged from their hidden bases to join the pursuit. Even the cautious, peaceful hegemony authorized the deployment of their reserve fleets. The humans have done the impossible, transmitted Fleet Command. Node Zephyr 7. They have shown the galaxy that the swarm can be beaten. But Admiral Chen knew the war was far from over. As her fleet pursued the retreating swarm toward their core territories, she understood that the real test was still coming. They had surprised the swarm, confused it, even frightened it. But somewhere, in the dark reaches of space, the collective intelligence was adapting, learning, preparing to face this new threat. "Ma'am," called Lieutenant Park, "long-range sensors are detecting massive movement in the void sector. It looks like the swarm is consolidating all remaining forces." Sarah studied the sensor readings. The retreating swarm entities were gathering at their most ancient stronghold, a region of space that had been off-limits to all life for over 1,000 years. If they were going to end this war, they would have to face the swarm in its home. "Territory. Signal all Alliance fleets," she ordered. "Set course for the void sector. We're going to finish what we started." As the greatest military alliance in galactic history prepared for the final battle, one thing was clear. The age of hiding from the swarm was over. The galaxy had remembered how to fight back, and they were going to see it through to the end. The final battle for the void sector began with the largest military gathering in galactic history. Over 100,000 ships from dozens of species surrounded the ancient swarm stronghold, their combined light turning the dark region of space into a constellation of hope. Admiral Sarah Chen, now commanding what had become known as the Liberation Fleet, stood on the bridge of the UES Defiance and studied the tactical displays. Ahead of them lay the heart of swarm territory, a cluster of dead systems where the creatures had been spawning for millennia. "Final sensor sweep complete," reported Captain Martinez. "Swarm numbers are significant. We're looking at approximately 50,000 entities concentrated in the core system." "More than we've ever faced at once," added Commander Torres. "But they're not spreading out like before. They're staying clustered around their breeding worlds." Sarah nodded. After weeks of pursuit and engagement, the patterns were clear. The swarm was no longer the confident predator that had terrorized the galaxy for 3,000 years. They were behaving like a cornered animal, desperate and dangerous, but also frightened. "Signal all fleet commanders," she ordered. "We go in together. No reserves, no holding back. Today we end this." The assault on the void sector was unlike any battle in recorded history. Instead of the careful, defensive strategies that other species had developed over millennia, the Liberation Fleet attacked with a ferocity that matched the humans who led it. Wave after wave of ships poured into the swarm's home systems using tactics that continued to confuse and terrorize their enemies. Human kamikaze runs devastated swarm formations. Alliance forces coordinated attacks that came from every direction at once. Most importantly, they fought with something the swarm had never encountered before: unshakable determination. "Swarm. Entities are breaking formation in Sector 7, reported Lieutenant Park. "The Crystal Collective reports complete destruction of enemy forces in their assigned zone. Ghost Fleet Collective has eliminated all swarm presence in the outer ring," added Communications Officer Davis. "They are requesting permission to advance to the breeding worlds." Sarah watched the tactical display as system after system fell to the Liberation Fleet. What should have been the hardest battle in galactic history was becoming a systematic dismantling of an enemy that had forgotten how to lose. But the real victory came when Captain Lisa Zhang, leading the assault on the primary breeding world, reported something that sent shockwaves through the entire fleet. "Admiral," Zhang's voice crackled over the communications system, "you need to see this. The swarm entities. They're surrendering." For a moment, the bridge of the Defiance was completely silent. In 3,000 years of galactic history, no one had ever seen a swarm entity surrender. They fought until destroyed or withdrew to regroup. Surrender was not part of their nature. "Repeat that, Captain," Sarah said carefully. "Ma'am, the remaining swarm entities have stopped attacking. They're communicating, not with each other, with us. We're getting what appears to be a surrender signal." The implications hit everyone at once. The swarm wasn't just an unstoppable force of nature, it was an intelligent species that could choose to stop fighting, and for the first time in millennia, they were choosing peace over destruction. "All ships, cease fire," Sarah ordered immediately. "Do not engage unless fired upon first." What followed was the most extraordinary first contact event in galactic history. The swarm entities, creatures that had been silent killers for thousands of years, began transmitting complex mathematical patterns that gradually resolved into recognizable language. The message, when finally decoded, was simple and heartbreaking. "We remember now. We remember what we were before the hunger. Please, help us remember more." The truth that emerged over the following days changed everything the galaxy thought it knew about the Void Swarm. They had not always been destroyers. Millions of years ago, they had been a peaceful species that had evolved to consume energy from dead matter, cleaning up the detritus of the galaxy. But something had gone wrong. A cosmic disaster had forced them to adapt their feeding patterns to survive, and over millennia, they had become addicted to the energy of living worlds. The collective trauma had driven them mad, turning them into the very thing they had once protected the galaxy from. "They've been trapped in a cycle of compulsive feeding for 3 million years, reported Dr. Velthera, who had been studying the swarm communications. "The aggression, the systematic destruction, it's all been a form of species-wide mental illness. The humans, with their characteristic refusal to accept that any problem was unsolvable, immediately began working on treatment options. Working. With the Eternal Watch, the Ghost Fleet Collective, and the galaxy's best xenopsychologists, they developed a therapy program for an entire species. Admiral Chen stood in the same council chamber where she had first announced humanity's intention to march to war. But this time, she wasn't alone. Representatives of the reformed swarm stood beside her, their dark forms somehow less menacing than before. "Honored Council," she began, "I'm pleased to report that the war is over, but more than that, we've gained new allies." The silence that followed was different from the shocked quiet that had greeted her first appearance. This was the silence of beings trying to process something that redefined their understanding of the universe. "The creatures we knew as the Void Swarm are actually the gardeners," Sarah continued. "Before their trauma, they maintained the balance of life and death in the galaxy. With treatment and support, they can return to that role." Elder Morden, his ancient voice trembling with emotion, was the first to speak. "Admiral Chen, are you saying that the greatest threat our galaxy has ever known has become a force for good?" "I'm saying that sometimes the most broken things can be healed," Sarah replied. "It just takes someone willing to try." The transformation that followed was remarkable even by the standards of what the galaxy had already witnessed. The former swarm entities, now calling themselves the Restored Gardeners, began working to repair the damage they had caused over millennia. Dead systems that had been stripped of all life began to flourish again as the gardeners applied their ancient knowledge of cosmic ecology. Worlds that had been written off as permanent wasteland became gardens that put the most advanced terraforming to shame. But perhaps the most significant change was in the galaxy itself. The successful campaign against the swarm had created the largest military alliance in history, and that alliance wasn't disbanding now that the war was over. Species that had never worked together before had learned that they were stronger united than divided. "The Liberation Fleet is requesting permission to become a permanent organization," reported Representative Velcara to the Galactic Council. "They want to call it the Galactic Defense Alliance." The proposal passed unanimously. For the first time in the galaxy's recorded history, there was a unified force dedicated to protecting all civilized worlds from any threat that might emerge. Admiral Sarah Chen, now promoted to Supreme Commander of the Galactic Defense Alliance, stood on the observation deck of the new headquarters station that orbited the former swarm stronghold. Around her, ships from dozens of species worked alongside. Restored Gardener bioforms to continue the healing of ancient wounds. "Ma'am," said Captain Martinez, now her chief of staff, "the latest reports from the frontier worlds. No hostile activity detected anywhere in the galaxy. The last of the rogue swarm entities have either been reformed or relocated to rehabilitation facilities." Sarah nodded. watching a group of young beings from various species training together in the station's main hangar. Humans worked alongside crystalline collective youth, ghost fleet cyborgs, and even young gardeners learning to control their ancient abilities. "You know what the most important thing we accomplished was?" she asked. Martinez considered the question. "Ending the swarm threat?" "No," Sarah said softly. "We reminded the galaxy that some things are worth fighting for, that running away isn't always the answer, that sometimes, if you want to save something, you have to be willing to risk everything for it." She turned from the observation window to face her aide. "For 3,000 years, the galaxy lived in fear. Every species accepted that some problems were too big to solve, some enemies too powerful to fight. We changed that." "And now?" Martinez asked. Sarah smiled, the expression brighter than any he had seen from her during the dark days of the war. "Now we get to find out what a galaxy without fear can accomplish." The transformation was already beginning. Research projects that had been abandoned as too dangerous were restarted with Gardner assistance. Exploration missions pushed beyond the galactic rim for the first time in millennia. Most importantly, species that had been content to simply survive began dreaming again. The message that went out to every world in the galaxy was simple, but it carried the power to change everything. The age of hiding is over. The age of building has begun. Humanity had marched to battle against an unbeatable enemy, and in winning, they had given the galaxy something more valuable than victory. They had given it hope for the future.